What if the neatness of your spreadsheets and the elegance of your code could never quiet the noise inside your own head? What if the empire you built brick by brick, license by license, line by line, stood on ground that never stopped trembling? He used to walk late at night, long after the lights of the glass tower dimmed, his steps echoing off halls built to hold certainty. In those hours, certainty was the first thing to go. The city glittered beneath him like a circuit board, and he could trace a current from corner office to corner office, from server room to living room, from his name on a box to his name in a courtroom he could not control. He would ask himself a question no market share graph could answer. When does winning become a habit you can no longer separate from the person you want to be? He did not begin as a tower. He started as a boy with glasses too big for his face and time too small for his appetite. He felt numbers like rhythm, logic like oxygen. He had a friend, the kind of friend who arrives exactly when you need your wildest ideas to stop being fantasies. Together, they stared at a beige metal box in a motel room and saw a continent. While other people saw a novelty, they saw a language waiting for verbs. They wrote, rewrote, and wrote again, feeding nights into a future that didn't yet exist. The world had no word for what they were building, so they gave it one. A company that made software the center of gravity. He learned early that code might be poetry, but distribution was power. There was a deal with a blue-blooded giant of machines, and he did something that sounded small, but was everything he licensed. He didn't sell. The rights stayed home. The product traveled. That decision turned a narrow hallway into a highway with no speed limit. The operating system first, in its unsmiling, utilitarian form, and later draped in windows, like a city finally opening its blinds, became the face people met when they woke their computers. He watched the world learn new habits using tools he had placed in their hands. He learned to measure the world with adoption curves and revenue arcs. He learned to keep the rhythm of an industry with a metronome that sounded like quarterly earnings. On launch days, he stood in rooms humming with electric anticipation. Banners hung straight. Cameras found him easily. Partners smiled the way people smile when their fortunes are braided together. He was a conductor raising his baton over millions of devices, a name stamped on boxes, manuals, screens. The world standardized on him. Developers made a living guessing his next move. Competitors rearranged their calendars by his keynotes. The press called him a wizard, a general, a tyrant, a visionary. He wore each label like a badge and a weight. Success can be a mirror that only reflects what you feed it. As ubiquity turned into normalcy, he learned a revised grammar of ambition. Verbs like dominate, defend, extend. Nouns like platform, ecosystem, moat. Inside the company, he drilled meetings into instruments of precision. He knew how to be charming, but he often chose to be bracing. He interrupted, challenged, interrogated, reducing pitches to their atoms. Some people left those rooms feeling sharpened. Others left them feeling erased. He calibrated himself by the logic of outcomes. If the product improved, if the market moved, if the numbers rose, then the tone was correct. That was the arithmetic he trusted. But arithmetic is not a universal solvent. Beyond the glass facade, a different equation gathered force. Fear in the hearts of rivals. Fear in regulators who had watched this platform become the road, the car, and the rules of the road. He knew the rumors. 3-word strategies said with a smirk in hacker circles. Accusations of bundling and binding. He also knew his own truth. He believed in making the product better, faster, more integrated, more indispensable. To him, integration was elegance. To others, it smelled like enclosure. The first subpoenas were paper, but they felt like steel. Emails became exhibits. Strategy memos, once written for war rooms, now found themselves under fluorescent lights in courts where metaphors didn't help. He'd always been good at cutting through arguments. Depositions taught him how arguments could cut back. Lawyers asked questions with sharp corners, and he learned that precision under oath was a different sport than precision under pressure. Clips of him played on television pauses, amplified, expressions paused mid-blink, turning a human into an angle. He noticed how the world loves a reversal story. The unbeatable brand turned into a defendant, a wizard standing there without a wand. Inside the company, people kept shipping, because shipping is how you breathe when the air gets thin. The operating system still rolled forward. The office suite still opened and saved. But all momentum gains a shadow. Meetings included new phrases, consent decrees, oversight, monitoring words that don't help a product run faster, but can slow the blood in a room. He took stock, not of money, there was plenty, but of levers he no longer fully controlled. He had always believed in outworking your problems. He discovered there are some problems that arrive immune to effort. He made adjustments. A trusted lieutenant took the title that had once seemed welded to his name, and he moved one chair over and one layer deeper. Out front, he began to talk about safety, reliability, trust. He wrote a memo that treated the soft art of trust like the hard science of code, and the company tried to pivot a culture built on velocity toward one that could live with brakes. Security storms had battered the windows. Worms with names like brief, cruel jokes, viruses that turned networks into proof-of-concept nightmares. If code is a conversation, the world had answered, and the answer drew blood. He wanted the conversation to become humane again. Beyond commerce, he had been thinking about a different kind of scale. The same mind that loved to reduce complex systems into tractable problems began asking questions cruel in their simplicity. Why should a child die of a disease we can prevent? How do you bend a curve that has remained rigid for centuries? He put his name on something that wasn't a product, a foundation, an instrument for turning abstract concern into measurable interventions. Bed nets, vaccines, data. He listened to people who had worked their entire lives in the fields he had just walked into. He tried to build a place where patients could coexist with urgency. In meetings far from code reviews, he wrestled with a new kind of complexity, the kind measured not in milliseconds but in lives, not in user counts, but in children who reach their 5th birthdays. But the shape of a life does not respect tidy acts. If one empire is built on distribution and the other on compassion measured at scale, both are still empires, and empires invite suspicion. The same cameras that once adored his confident explanations now pointed at him with questions about influence. Who elected you to steer the fate of millions? What happens when a fortune becomes a lever large enough to move a continent's priorities? He could answer with facts and data and outcomes, but he could not answer the fear under the questions. The fear that even good intentions can reshape the human map in ways no ballot ever requested. He understood this in the way a mathematician understands that the answer is correct, even if the equation looks strange to an observer. He also understood something colder, that the culture of winning leaves footprints on every floor you have ever walked. He had no illusions about his early years. He had been sharp-edged, sometimes cruel, brilliant enough to make a planet orbit him, and human enough to misjudge what that orbit cost. People he had once hurt now had microphones, and the internet turned whispers into choruses with a speed that mocked the patience of truth. He learned that some reputational debts compound faster than capital. Nights grew heavier. The tower felt taller. He would step to the window and see the air triangulated by aircraft, each one a hum of purpose he could feel but not touch. Friends became advisors. Advisors became staff. Staff became strangers with badges. His calendar expanded while his ability to surprise himself shrank. He could still summon the old thrill, those moments when someone showed him an elegant solution, and he felt the spark leap, but the spark had to jump a canyon now. He had become the man people presented to, Not the boy who stayed awake 2 nights to repair a memory leak no one else had even noticed yet. Then came mornings when the newspaper framed him not as builder or donor, but as symbol. In some narratives, he was the cipher for everything people fear about power without borders. In others, he was an index of what modern generosity could do when it refused to be shy. The truth lived somewhere Messier, and it did not fit in headlines. He began to sense that his name had become public property, a set of magnets for hopes and rage. He could support people with better voices in certain arenas. He could choose quieter rooms, but the noise would not leave him. He was too large to disappear and too complicated to caricature, though caricature is what the world often prefers. He kept searching for problems he could still solve. Climate, perhaps the stubborn arithmetic of carbon, the physics that do not forgive aspiration. He met engineers with dirty hands and clean blueprints, ran his fingers over materials that might someday replace the dead weight of our habits. He wrote about it, spoke about it, placed bets the way a man places bets when he knows that even a losing bet can move the conversation in the right direction. He could not stop being a strategist. He simply changed the board. But strategy has never been a cure for loneliness. There were rooms where the chair beside him remained empty long after the cameras left. The whisper of a life lived at maximum speed is that someday the speed leaves and the whispers remain. He had formed a marriage when the empire was still young, raised children while the world reconfigured around his face. He tried to seal certain rooms from the weather outside, but weather respects no architecture. The stories came, did what stories do, lingered and evaporated, left residue. And the residue is what you carry, pressed into memory like a fingerprint you can't rub away. He discovered that a life can be both admired and misunderstood. A house can be vast and still echo. He did not fall in a way that accountants could measure. Empires this large do not topple, they recalibrate. He remained rich beyond any practical need, and wherever he went, microphones found him, as they always had. But what changed, and perhaps what counts as a fall in a life like his, was the private arithmetic. You begin with the assumption that your mind's sharpness is the blade that will cut through any knot, and you end with a collection of knots that do not respond to steel. He had won too many games to pretend the scoreboard didn't matter. He had lost enough private moments to know it wasn't the only thing. And yet, even in the twilight spaces of an empire, there is work. He sits at tables where the minutes are slow and the stakes are human. He argues about delivery systems in rural clinics, about logistics that don't care about your last name, about software in service of people who will never learn your history. He still interrupts when he thinks someone is being imprecise. He still bristles at fluff. Old habits survive because they were never just habits, they were survival strategies. But he has learned, late and arduously, that precision without grace is a recipe for solitude. Sometimes he opens an old notebook and finds, in awkward handwriting, the kernel of who he was, a boy delighted by the solvable. He thinks about his friend, the one who walked with him at the beginning, and about all the beginnings that became endings without asking permission. He thinks about a judge's voice and a child's vaccination card, about layoffs and lab reports, about the cold light of a monitor at 3 a.m. and the warmer light of a clinic at dawn. He thinks about everything the word foundation can mean. He knows this. There are secrets and there are silences. A secret is something you guard because the revelation would harm someone you love or something you've built. A silence is something you keep because the world will not hear the nuance, only the noise. He has fewer secrets than people think and more silences than even he can name. If you asked him on those late-night walks to make a list of what he regrets, he would not say nothing. He would not say everything. He would list the times he confused correctness with kindness, victory with wisdom, influence with understanding. He would list the friendships he strained, the rooms he made colder than they needed to be, the moments he let the game turn him into its rules. The city still looks like a circuit board from up high. But he knows now that not every circuit is meant to be closed. Not every loop wants to be optimized. Some things must remain messy, living, human. The boy who loved the solvable became the man who learned to live with the remainder, the stubborn fraction that refuses to vanish when you divide your life by your accomplishments. He breathes, he looks out. He wonders if the empire he built will ever truly understand the person who built it, and if the person he became can ever truly forgive the empire for the ways it shaped him. He thought he understood the physics of leverage. A small shift in the right place moves the world. But power changes the texture of truth. In the early years, the browser looked like a gadget. Then it became oxygen. He had dismissed it until the numbers told a different story. And when the numbers spoke, he did what he always did. He moved with terrifying clarity. Bundles were not, to him, shackles. They were symphonies, instruments tuned to play together. Out in the wild, though, the music sounded like fences. The courts wrote history in paragraphs that refused to applaud engineering elegance. He found himself parsing verbs with attorneys rather than verbs with coders, translating product strategy into something a judge could live with. He had won so many arguments in windowless rooms that he hadn't noticed how few of those victories taught him to be understood by people who never wanted to be impressed. He had believed in winning because winning kept the lights on, kept the talent near, kept the flywheel warm. But winning has a flavor, and too much of it numbs the mouth. The company's cadence ship, dominate, iterate, repeat worked until the repetition itself became a vulnerability. Rivals learned to be nimble in the gaps between releases. New movements formed around words not yet meaningful to him. Open, free, distributed. He could appreciate craft anywhere he saw it. He respected grit. He knew excellent work when he saw it. Yet he also felt a reflex he could not immediately quiet. To say no. To say not yet. To assert that coherence mattered more than purity. The reflex was not evil. It was simply the logic of a platform raised to believe its gravity was a public utility. Inside those glass walls, he conducted confrontations like experiments. He wrote emails that were knives and scalpels at once, slicing away comfort until only the tendon of an argument remained. Some people thrived under that light. They came alive when called to justify a product's existence down to the last kilobyte. Others learned to hide. It took him too long to see the difference. He told himself that the harshness was fair because it was evenly applied, because it made the product better, because markets are wild animals and you don't survive by petting them. He did not see, not at first, how even fairness can be a form of coldness, and how coldness erodes the bridges you will one day need. The antitrust saga unfurled like a slow sermon delivered in public squares. He recognized pieces of his own thinking on projector screens in rooms he did not control. He disliked imprecision in others. He discovered how much he detested it in himself when his words, lifted and framed by adversaries, sounded like intentions he did not claim. He told himself the world had misunderstood the geometry of integration. The world told him that geometry is not the only math that matters. Somewhere in that friction, his certainty learned to blink. He delegated and learned what delegation really means, not just assigning responsibility, but letting go of the pleasure of always being the smartest person in the room. He moved from builder-in-chief to strategist-in-chief, then further to something stranger, a figure whose ideas could redirect research budgets in countries he had never visited as a young engineer. He stood on stages where code was a metaphor rather than a product, where he talked about mortality curves and the tyranny of distance. He kept spreadsheets, yes, but the columns were different now. Not SKS and SKS and SKUs, but regions and doses and timelines translated into lives saved or lost. And yet, the past did not vanish. It never does. Old emails do not burn. Old clips do not fade. Old colleagues do not forget. He found himself at dinners where a joke about the early days tumbled into a silence that neither dessert nor coffee could sweeten. He apologized, sometimes publicly, sometimes in the notes of meetings people would never see. He tried to become more patient than he had ever thought useful. He hired people whose expertise was so vast, he could only nod and ask better questions. He tried to discover whether humility could be learned late. It can, but like any language acquired as an adult, you speak it with an accent that never entirely goes away. On the outside, new tempests rose, loud and multiplying. The internet he had helped normalize became a hall of mirrors, where his face appeared in versions he did not recognize. Conspiracies thrive where complexity lives, and his name, as shorthand for complexity, became a magnet for stories that could not be disproven because they were not built to be. He would read a rumor that rendered his life a plot and feel the odd numbness that comes when your biography has been replaced by a genre. He had always known narratives mattered. He had underestimated how many of them would be told without him. He entered a different season of life with the awkwardness of a man whose calendars were precise while his heart felt uncalibrated. He had believed that a home could be insulated from weather, that affection could be scheduled and still be genuine. He had tried truly to keep promises, to be present, to remember birthdays and rehearsals, to listen without solving. Sometimes he succeeded. Sometimes he failed in the ordinary ways human beings fail. When the private became public, as it tends to for those whose names double as brands, he learned anew the difference between regret and shame. Regret asks you to do better. Shame only asks you to disappear. He chose regret. Time, meanwhile, did what time always does. Software stacks changed beneath the feet of an industry that never learned to stand still. His company iterated itself through eras that did not require his hand on every lever. He became something like a patron saint and a lightning rod at once, a proof that the long arc of technology can lift whole societies, and also a warning that arcs do not apologize when they miss. He tried to be specific where the world was vague, to insist on numbers where slogans would have been easier. He would stand in rooms with presidents and village health workers, trying to honor both kinds of power without lying to either. It is difficult. It exhausts you in a way that is not visible on a balance sheet. He made mistakes in the new arena, too. He pushed on solutions that solved 90% of a problem and discovered how loudly the remaining 10% can scream. He spoke confidently and then learned again how confidence can curdle into hubris in the ears of people who do not trust the hands holding the wheel. A vaccine delivered late is not a vaccine. A cold chain that fails by 1 degree is a broken promise. He learned to see how infrastructure is a moral category. He invested in things that took longer than a headline's patience. He waited. He kept waiting. He learned to celebrate progress measured in decimals. He learned to accept that some problems are not solved so much as stewarded. On some nights, the old itch returned not for courtrooms or product launches, but for a kind of work that felt like play. He would slip into a lab, run his fingers along the edges of a prototype, ask questions so sharp the room sat up straight. He knew what it meant when an engineer's eyes lit with the recognition that someone truly, finally understood what they had been trying to do. He loved that feeling as much as he ever had. It remained honest in a world that now required him to spend most of his hours translating. The translation did not always leave him feeling noble. It left him feeling necessary and a little unmade. He visited places where his name meant less than the pressure in the air and the size of the mosquitoes. He sat with mothers who had lost 3 children and were praying without words that the 4th would see morning. He listened to a nurse talk him through a routine that would break most people. Dawn rounds, dusk rounds, the midnight call, the sorrow that never acquired scar tissue. He listened not the way a billionaire listens when searching for a story to justify a grant, but the way a builder listens when the foundation groans. He brought resources, yes, but he learned to bring attention to and memory, and the kind of stubborn kindness that refuses to become sentimental. He also learned about the limits of redistribution as a narrative of absolution. You cannot buy back lost time with your children or replace trust with projects, no matter how elegantly they are managed. He did not think of his giving as penance, but he refused to let it become costume jewelry for a public life. He wanted to be judged by outcomes, and also knew that outcomes can never fully repay the private debts one accumulates on the way to extraordinary influence. When critics accused him of engineering policy with money, he argued his case and examined his conscience. He adjusted. He tried to partner rather than impose, to ask rather than instruct. He failed at this sometimes, and when he did, he said so to the people who had the standing to hear it. There was a winter when he stayed longer than usual in the place, where his desk still faced a lake slate gray under a sky the color of unsent emails. He would walk the path, cold burning his face until his thoughts went simple. He thought about the first program he wrote that made him laugh aloud with delight. He thought about the grin of a kid in a far country who had just received a vaccine that would save him from a disease the kid did not know he was supposed to fear. He thought about a judge's voice reading a decision. He thought about a colleague who once told him, shaking, that she had dreaded his feedback for a week and had cried afterward in a conference room no one used. He wrote her a letter that he did not send. He began to write more letters he did not send, not as cowardice, but as discipline. The discipline of saying the true thing without rushing to correct it by saying 10 more true things in a tone that undid the first. There were parties, fewer now, where the conversation flexed around him, as if he were furniture the hosts could not move. He smiled more. He interrupted less. He learned to leave early without making the exit feel dramatic. He avoided cameras when the subject was grief. He did not audition for sainthood. He maintained a neatness in his clothes that felt like a promise to himself, that even if he would never again control the plot the way he had at 35, he could respect the scene by showing up prepared. He taught himself to take pleasure in advising without annexing. He backed founders who reminded him of the boy in the motel room, not because he wanted to relive it, but because he wanted to be the kind of elder who hands you the screwdriver you didn't know you needed and then walks away. He tried not to cast a shadow so broad that it killed the plants. He did not always succeed. He measured his failures differently now, by how quickly he could notice them and repair the damage. Repair became a verb he loved. If you were to ask him, without microphones, what the secret had been all along, he would hesitate. He never liked words like destiny. He would say luck, but only after acknowledging the kinds of luck that come dressed as discipline, the hours, the miles, the bone-deep refusal to let a problem rest until it surrendered. He would say partnership, and he would mean it. He would say that everything he built was built with someone whose name belongs in the first paragraph, not just the footnotes. He would say that the fall, such as it was, began the day he started believing he could edit the human cost of velocity out of a ledger. In the end, he accepted a paradox that younger him would have labeled intolerable, that you can be right and do harm, that you can do good and be mistrusted, that you can spend a fortune fighting a disease and still be the subject of a meme that makes your daughter close her laptop and sigh. He accepted that reputations are communal property. He accepted that people will use his name to fight arguments he will never hear. He accepted that his most honest work now involves placing his mind at the service of goals he may not live to see completed, and doing it without asking the world to love him for it. One evening, he stood again by the glass, the city below pulsing like a motherboard, left on after a long day. He thought of a single window on a single machine, opening without drama, enabling anyone to write a letter, compile a program, balance a household budget, find a friend, He thought of a clinic morning where a line forms before dawn and ends with a child not dying. He thought of a courtroom where words were weighed and found wanting, and of a kitchen table where, years later, he finally said he was sorry and meant it. He traced with his finger on the cold glass a shape that looked like a question mark until the fog of his breath erased it. He turned off the light as he left the room, not to be modest, but because he had finally learned that not everything has to be lit to be real. There is no crescendo here, no clean fall from a tower, and no miraculous catch at the last second. The story refuses spectacle, because spectacle would be untrue. Empires rarely explode. They settle. The man did not vanish. He adjusted. He carries his silences like a briefcase, and his regrets like a second heartbeat. He attends meetings where the agenda is boring, and the consequences are not. He speaks, and sometimes he is heard clearly, and sometimes the echo distorts him. He is learning, still, to live inside the distortion without letting it define him. If there is a moral, it is stubborn and unmarketable. That greatness can be dangerous when it forgets its scale. That ambition without tenderness will salt the earth it conquers. That money is a powerful tool and a poor language. That secrecy solves problems until it becomes the problem. That the climb is thrilling and the view is deceptive. That the price of building something so large that people cannot avoid it is that you will never again be a private person. That justice, when it arrives, seldom looks like ruin and often looks like a rebalancing of weight you should have redistributed earlier. He is not absolved, and he is not condemned. He is simply a man whose mind altered the ordinary and whose shadow stretched farther than his eyes could see. He wakes early. He reads. He sends a note to a team that is 3 years into a project that may save 1 million lives if it works and still be mocked if it does. He drinks coffee. He walks. He tries, on good days, to replace certainty with attention. He allows the remainder to remain. And in the quiet, when the city is a low hum and the lake is a mirror without a face, he answers the old question at last. Winning becomes a habit the day you confuse it with meaning. Meaning has to be made and remade again, in rooms with people who do not care what you once were called, only whether you will show up when it's dark and stay until there is light.